The elevator doors open, then they close, then they open again. A young woman steps out into the hallway, presses herself against the wall, and peers around the corner as if she is looking for someone, or hiding from someone. She steps back inside. She pushes multiple buttons. She holds her hands out in front of her, fingers splayed, and watches them as if they belong to someone else. The doors do not close. She steps out one more time, looks down the corridor in both directions, and then she is gone. The elevator stands empty, its doors finally sliding shut on their own. That footage was captured on January 31st, 2013, at the Cecil Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. It was the last confirmed visual record of Elisa Lam, a 21-year-old student from Vancouver, Canada. She had been staying at the hotel alone, midway through a solo trip down the California coast. She was due to check out in 2 days. She never did. 14 days passed before anyone found her. And where they found her, and how, is the part of this story that has never stopped demanding an answer. To understand what the Cecil Hotel meant in January of 2013, you have to understand what it had always been. The building rises 14 stories above Main Street in the Skid Row district of Los Angeles, a neighborhood that has carried decades of concentrated poverty, addiction, and street crime within a few square blocks of the city's financial core. The hotel opened in 1927, built during the brief window when downtown Los Angeles still imagined itself as a cosmopolitan destination, a place where traveling salesmen and middle-class tourists might stay a week, take in a show at one of the nearby theaters, and feel like they were somewhere that mattered. The lobby was finished in marble, the ceilings were high, the light fixtures were ornate. For about 2 decades, the Cecil was exactly what its architects intended it to be. That window closed quickly and did not reopen. By the 1950s, the Cecil had already accumulated a reputation that no amount of renovation would fully erase. At least 3 guests died by suicide within its walls during that decade alone, according to historical accounts of the building. The neighborhood around it had shifted dramatically. The theaters closed, the retail corridors emptied, and the blocks surrounding Main Street became home to the kind of concentrated urban poverty that mid-century city planning had no effective answer for. The Cecil adapted, as buildings do, to the population it served. Long-term residents replaced short-term guests. The marble lobby accumulated the particular kind of grime that comes not from neglect, but from use, from hundreds of people moving through a space every day with nowhere else to go. In the 1980s, serial killer Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, responsible for at least 13 murders across California between 1984 and 1985, used a room on the 14th floor as his base of operations during part of his killing spree. He would return from crime scenes in the early morning hours, take the elevator up to his floor, and deposit his bloody clothing in the dumpster behind the building before walking back upstairs. Guests in nearby rooms reportedly noticed an odor they could not identify, something metallic and wrong, before anyone understood what it meant. Ramirez was eventually identified and arrested in 1985. His connection to the Cecil became one of the most frequently cited facts in the building's history, the kind of detail that lodges itself in a place's identity and does not let go. A few years after Ramirez, Austrian serial killer Jack Unterweger arrived at the Cecil. Unterweger had been convicted of murder in Austria in 1976, served 11 years, and was released after convincing the Austrian justice system that he had rehabilitated himself through writing. He published an autobiography and became something of a celebrated figure in European literary circles, a reformed criminal turned artist. In 1991, he traveled to Los Angeles, ostensibly as a journalist covering crime in the city for an Austrian magazine. He stayed at the Cecil Hotel. During that same stay, he murdered at least 3 women in the Los Angeles area, all sex workers, all killed in a manner consistent with his earlier crimes in Europe. He was eventually extradited, convicted, and died in custody in 1994. His stay at the Cecil had lasted only a few weeks, but it added another layer to the building's accumulating history of violence. The building knew violence. It had absorbed it for 60 years. By the time Elisa Lam walked through its front doors on January 26, 2013, rolling a single suitcase through the lobby and checking in at the front desk. She had flown into Los Angeles from Vancouver and checked in under a budget travel booking. The Cecil, by 2013, operated a portion of its rooms under the name Stay on Main, a rebranded hostel section intended to attract backpackers and budget travelers, separating them, at least nominally, from the long-term residents who occupied other floors. The separation was partly cosmetic. The building was still the same building. The elevator was still the same elevator. Elisa was booked into the hostel section, paying somewhere in the range of $60 a night for a shared floor room in a 14-story building with a history that most of its newer guests either did not know or had chosen to find romantic rather than troubling. For a certain kind of traveler, young, curious, drawn to the layered textures of cities rather than their polished surfaces, the Cecil's reputation was part of its appeal. Elisa was 21 years old, a student at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. She was studying sociology, a discipline that requires a particular kind of attention to the way people organize themselves and the spaces they inhabit. She had traveled before, shorter trips, closer to home, but this California trip was longer and more ambitious. She had planned it carefully. She had a rough itinerary: Los Angeles first, then south toward San Diego, possibly continuing further if the trip felt right. She was the kind of traveler who left room for improvisation. Her family knew she was traveling. She had been checking in regularly, calling and messaging her parents, Yina and David Lam, back in Vancouver. The calls were warm and ordinary. She described the weather, the neighborhoods she had walked through, the food she had eaten. She had visited the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County, spending several hours moving through its exhibition halls, and had posted about it on Tumblr with the kind of genuine enthusiasm that is difficult to manufacture. She had photographed the building's exterior, the exhibits, the light coming through the high windows. She was enjoying herself. Her Tumblr blog, which she had maintained for several years before the trip, was a genuine document of who she was. It was not a travel blog in the conventional sense. It was more like a commonplace book made public. Quotes from books she was reading, photographs she had taken or found, observations about her own inner life written with a directness that was unusual, and to people who found it later deeply affecting. She wrote about literature. She wrote about music. She wrote about the experience of being a young person trying to understand herself and the world simultaneously, which is, of course, what most young people are doing, but which she articulated with more precision than most. She had also been open in her writing about living with bipolar disorder. She did not dramatize it or use it as the central organizing fact of her identity, but she did not hide it either. She described the experience of managing a mood disorder with the same matter-of-fact honesty she brought to everything else she wrote about. She had been diagnosed several years before the trip. She was on medication, a combination of drugs commonly prescribed for bipolar disorder, including an antidepressant and a mood stabilizer. She had a therapist she saw regularly in Vancouver. Her family described her as stable, happy, and genuinely excited about the California trip. She had done the work that managing a chronic condition requires, and she was, by all available accounts, doing it well. The disorder is relevant to what came later, not because it explains anything cleanly, and not because it should define how we understand her, but because it became one of the first things investigators and the public reached for when they needed an explanation for what the elevator footage showed. That reach was not always careful. It was not always fair to her, to the facts of the case, or to the millions of people who live with bipolar disorder and travel alone and do not come to harm. On the evening of January 31st, Elisa Lam was somewhere in the Cecil Hotel. She had been there for 5 days. She had, at some point during her stay, been moved out of her original room. Hotel staff later told investigators that her roommates in the shared accommodation had complained about her behavior, describing it as erratic. She had been given a private room on a different floor. The details of what specifically prompted the complaint and what floor she was moved to were not made fully public by the hotel or by the LAPD in the immediate aftermath of her disappearance. What is known is that at approximately 10:47 p.m. on January 31st, she entered the elevator on one of the hotel's upper floors. The security camera mounted in the upper corner of the elevator car recorded everything that followed. The footage runs for approximately 4 minutes and 17 seconds. In that time, Elisa pressed multiple floor buttons, stepped in and out of the elevator car at least 3 times, pressed herself against the wall of the hallway outside the elevator, looked in both directions down the corridor, held her hands out in front of her face and appeared to study them, and finally walked away down the hallway to the left of the elevator doors. The doors, which had remained open throughout the entire sequence, despite her repeated pressing of the floor buttons, slid closed after she was gone. 4 minutes and 17 seconds. It is a very short piece of footage. It has been watched, analyzed, and argued over more than almost any other piece of security camera video in the history of true crime documentation. And the reason is not simply that the footage is strange, though it is strange, but that it is strange in a way that resists easy categorization. It does not look like one thing. It looks like several things at once, depending on the framework the viewer brings to it. The Cecil Hotel had a rooftop. It was not accessible to guests, or rather, it was not supposed to be. The door leading from the interior stairwell to the rooftop was equipped with an alarm, meaning that opening it was supposed to trigger an alert to hotel staff or a monitoring system. There were security cameras positioned at various points in the building, including inside the elevator and in some of the corridors. The rooftop itself was not under continuous camera surveillance. The hotel's water supply came from 4 large cylindrical tanks mounted on the roof. A common arrangement for buildings of that era in Los Angeles, where rooftop water storage was standard infrastructure. The footage from the elevator was not reviewed in real time on the night of January 31st. It was not reviewed the following morning. It was not flagged by hotel staff as something that required attention, because no one at the hotel realized, in the immediate hours after it was recorded, that Elisa Lam had not returned to her room. The hotel's check-in procedures did not include any mechanism for verifying that guests had returned to their rooms at the end of the night. This was not unusual for a budget hotel. It was, however, a detail that would matter enormously in the days that followed. Elisa Lam was reported missing on February 1st, 2013, when she failed to check out, and her parents, having lost contact with her after she stopped responding to messages, called the Los Angeles Police Department. The call came in the morning. Officers arrived at the hotel within a few hours. They spoke with staff, examined the front desk records, and began a systematic search of the building. Floor by floor, room by room, stairwell by stairwell. They reviewed the security camera logs and found the elevator footage. They noted it. They held it while the investigation developed, which was standard procedure for footage that might be relevant to a criminal investigation. During those first 2 weeks, the LAPD search of the Cecil Hotel was extensive by the standards of a missing persons investigation. Officers moved through the building with flashlights, checking utility spaces, storage rooms, areas behind locked doors. The hotel's management provided access. A cadaver dog, an animal trained specifically to detect the scent of human decomposition, was brought in and walked through the building's corridors, up and down the stairwells, through the basement, across the lobby. The dog is a detail that matters, because cadaver dogs are not infallible, but they are highly reliable, and what this particular dog did at a specific point in the search was noted in the investigative record and has never been fully explained. At some point during the sweep, the dog signaled near the rooftop access area, a behavior that, in a trained cadaver dog, indicates the presence of decomposition scent. The signal was logged. Officers checked the door. They went up to the roof. They looked around. They did not open the water tanks. The search continued. No body was found inside the building. On February 6th, 5 days after she was reported missing, the LAPD released a formal missing persons bulletin with Elisa's photograph and a description of what she had been wearing the last time she was seen on camera. Her parents flew down from Vancouver. They held a press conference at the LAPD's downtown headquarters, standing in front of microphones in a room with fluorescent lighting and a backdrop bearing the department's seal, asking in measured, careful English for anyone with information about their daughter to come forward. The hotel's management issued a statement expressing cooperation with the investigation. The case was covered by local Los Angeles news outlets and by some Canadian media, given Elisa's Vancouver connection, but it had not yet broken into national or international attention. That changed on February 13th, when the LAPD made the decision to release the elevator footage to the public. The release was a calculated investigative move. The department hoped that someone who had been at the hotel that night, or who recognized Elisa's behavior or appearance, might come forward with information. The footage was posted to the LAPD's official YouTube channel and distributed to media outlets. Within hours, it had been embedded on news sites across the country. Within a day, it had been shared millions of times across social media platforms. Within a week, it had been viewed by various estimates somewhere between 15 and 30 million times. The response was unlike almost anything that had preceded it in the history of missing persons cases, because what the footage showed did not have an obvious explanation, and the internet of early 2013 was a place that had developed a powerful, organized, and sometimes destructive appetite for exactly that kind of puzzle. The behavior Elisa displayed in those 4 minutes and 17 seconds did not look, to most of the millions of people who watched it, like the behavior of someone experiencing a straightforward medical emergency. It did not look like someone who had taken too much of something and was disoriented. It looked, and this is the word that appeared in comment sections and forum threads and news articles with remarkable consistency, like someone who was afraid, specifically afraid of something located just beyond the edge of the camera's field of view. She pressed multiple floor buttons in rapid succession, as if trying urgently to get the doors to close and the elevator to move. She stepped out into the hallway, moved to the right, pressed herself flat against the wall beside the elevator doors, and looked around the corner in both directions, the posture of someone checking whether a space is clear before moving through it. She stepped back into the elevator. She pressed more buttons. She stepped out again, this time moving further to the left, out of the camera's sight entirely, for a period of approximately 30 seconds. When she returned to the elevator doorway, something in her body language had shifted. The urgency was gone. She seemed slower, almost fluid in her movements. She raised her hands in front of her face, fingers spread, and appeared to study them. She spoke. Her lips moved, though the footage had no audio. Then she walked away down the left corridor, and the elevator doors, which had remained open through the entire sequence, finally closed. That detail, the doors staying open, was one of the first things that drew sustained analytical attention. Elevator doors on a sensor-controlled system are designed to close after a set interval unless they are being actively held open, either by the door open button being depressed or by the elevator receiving a call from another floor. The doors at the Cecil stayed open for the entire duration of Elisa's time in the car, despite her pressing multiple buttons. Some viewers concluded that someone standing just outside the camera's frame was holding the door open button from the hallway panel. Others pointed to the possibility of a mechanical malfunction in an aging system. The hotel's elevator was old. The Cecil's infrastructure dated from the 1920s, though the elevator had been updated at various points, and its maintenance records were not made public. The LAPD stated that they examined the elevator after the footage was reviewed and found it functioning normally. They did not release detailed technical findings from that examination. On February 19, 2013, 19 days after Elisa was last seen on camera and 13 days after she was officially reported missing, a maintenance worker climbed to the Cecil Hotel's roof to investigate a series of complaints that had been coming in from guests over the preceding several days. The complaints were about the water. Guests on multiple floors had noticed that the water pressure from their taps was lower than normal. Some had noticed that the water itself looked wrong, slightly discolored, with an odor that guests variously described as musty or faintly sweet. The complaints had been logged. A maintenance worker had been dispatched. He climbed the access stairs to the roof, emerged into the January morning air, 14 stories above Main Street, and walked across the flat roof surface to the water tank platform. The tanks were roughly 8 feet tall and approximately 4 feet in diameter, large enough to hold several thousand gallons of water each, standard infrastructure for a building of the Cecil's age and size. The maintenance worker opened the inspection hatch on one of the tanks. He looked inside. He found Elisa Lam's body floating in the water. Her clothing was floating beside her. Her room key and other personal effects were also in the tank. She had been there, in that tank, for approximately 19 days. The water from that tank had been flowing into the hotel's plumbing system throughout that time, reaching the taps and showers on multiple floors. Guests had been using it. Some of them had been drinking it. When this fact became public, it generated a wave of horror that was entirely understandable and that added another layer of visceral wrongness to a case that was already deeply disturbing. The Los Angeles County Coroner's Office took custody of the body and conducted a full autopsy over the following days. The official cause of death was ruled accidental drowning. The toxicology panel, a comprehensive screen for drugs, alcohol, and other substances, showed the presence of several medications in her system, all of them consistent with her known prescriptions for bipolar disorder. There was no alcohol detected. There were no illegal substances. The levels of her prescribed medications were described in the coroner's report as consistent with therapeutic dosing, not with overdose. The physical examination of her body found no signs of trauma consistent with assault. No bruising, no ligature marks, no defensive wounds, no evidence of sexual assault. The manner of death was listed as accidental. That ruling landed with a weight that did not dissipate. It has not dissipated in the decades since. The questions that followed the coroner's finding were practical and specific. They have never been answered to the satisfaction of anyone who has looked carefully at the physical facts of the case. The rooftop door was alarmed. If Elisa had opened it to access the roof, why did no hotel staff member respond to the alarm? The hotel's management, when pressed on this point, said that the alarm may not have been functioning properly that night. No maintenance log was produced publicly to confirm or contradict this claim. The LAPD did not release findings from any examination of the alarm system's operational status on the night of January 31st. The hatch on the water tank was closed when the maintenance worker found it. This is one of the most persistently discussed details of the case because it is genuinely difficult to explain under the accidental scenario. The hatch was a heavy metal lid. Opening it required physical effort, lifting it and setting it aside, or propping it open. Getting into the tank from the outside would have required a person to climb the exterior of the tank, which had no external ladder on the side nearest the hatch, lift the heavy lid, and lower themselves into a container filled with water. The interior walls of the tank were smooth metal, offering no handholds or footholds. Getting out of the tank without assistance from outside would have been, by most physical assessments, extremely difficult if not impossible. And yet the hatch was found closed. The LAPD's position, as communicated through statements and later through investigator interviews, was that the hatch may have fallen closed after Elisa entered the tank, that its own weight, possibly combined with wind on the exposed rooftop, could have caused it to drop shut. The rooftop of the Cecil Hotel, 14 stories above a Los Angeles street, is exposed to the prevailing westerly winds that move through the basin most strongly in the late evening and early morning hours. A metal lid propped open at an angle on a windy surface could in theory fall closed. It is physically possible. It has not been demonstrated with certainty for the specific hatch on the specific night. These were not questions invented after the fact by people looking for a conspiracy. They were questions raised in the immediate aftermath of the body's discovery by the family's legal team, by journalists covering the case from mainstream outlets, and by the coroner's own investigator, whose report acknowledged the unusual circumstances of the body's position and the closed hatch without resolving them. The investigator noted the questions. The report did not provide definitive answers. Detective Wallace Tinnell, one of the lead investigators assigned to the case by the LAPD, gave interviews in the years following the investigation in which he maintained that the evidence, taken as a whole, supported the coroner's finding of accidental death. He acknowledged the questions about the tank access and the alarm. He said that under a careful examination of all available evidence, the toxicology, the physical evidence at the scene, the absence of any indication of another person's involvement, accidental entry remained the most supportable conclusion the investigation could reach. He did not claim that every question had been answered. He said the answers that were available pointed in one direction. The family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the Cecil Hotel in the months following Elisa's death. The lawsuit alleged negligence, specifically that the hotel had failed to take adequate precautions to prevent guests from accessing the rooftop and the water tanks, that the alarm system had not been properly maintained, and that the hotel's security protocols were insufficient for a building that housed vulnerable guests. The lawsuit was settled out of court in 2014. The financial terms were not disclosed. Because the case settled before trial, no hotel documents, maintenance records, or internal communications were entered into the public court record through the discovery process. Whatever those documents might have shown about the alarm's operational history, the tank's accessibility, and the hotel's awareness of rooftop hazards remained private. Meanwhile, on the internet, the case had taken on a life that operated almost entirely independently of the official investigation, and that grew more elaborate with each passing month. The elevator footage had been viewed, by some estimates, more than 30 million times by the end of 2013. Dedicated analysis threads appeared on Reddit, on 4chan, and on dozens of smaller forums, some of which ran to hundreds of thousands of comments. The theories that emerged from these threads covered an enormous range, from the plausible to the fanciful to the genuinely unhinged. Some focused on the supernatural. The Cecil Hotel's documented history made it a natural anchor for claims about hauntings, residual energy, and paranormal influence, and certain corners of the internet became convinced that the elevator footage showed evidence of demonic possession, ghostly contact, or some form of spiritual disturbance. These theories were not supported by any evidence, but they were widely shared, and in some online communities treated as seriously as any other hypothesis. There was a tuberculosis testing kit used extensively in clinical settings across the United States that bore the trade name LAM-ELISA, an acronym derived from the technical name of the immunological test it performed, an enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay designed to detect a specific tuberculosis antigen. During the weeks after Elisa's body was found, a tuberculosis outbreak was reported in the Skid Row neighborhood surrounding the Cecil Hotel. The testing kit's name, the outbreak's location, and Elisa Lam's name converged in the minds of certain online investigators into something that felt like a hidden signal, as if the universe, or someone, had embedded a message in the coincidence. It was not a hidden signal. The LAM-ELISA test had existed for years before Elisa Lam was born, named for entirely unrelated scientific terminology. The tuberculosis outbreak was a public health event connected to the neighborhood's population density and living conditions, not to the Cecil Hotel or to Elisa. But the convergence of names was arresting, and the internet's appetite for pattern recognition treated it as significant regardless. A Japanese horror film called Dark Water, released in 2002 and remade in the United States in 2005, featured a central plot element involving a body discovered in a rooftop water tank of an apartment building. The film had been in wide release and home video distribution for years before Elisa Lam's death. When the similarity was noted, and it was noted almost immediately after the circumstances of her death became public, it spread through online discussion with a speed that reflected how powerfully the case had captured people's imaginations. Some treated the similarity as a coincidence worth noting and then setting aside. Others incorporated it into theories about fate, about art anticipating reality, about the Cecil Hotel's connection to something larger and darker than ordinary human events. None of this was grounded in evidence. All of it contributed to a narrative environment in which the actual facts of the case became increasingly difficult to locate beneath the layers of speculation. The most consequential and damaging consequence of the internet's engagement with the Elisa Lam case was what happened to a young musician who went by the name Morbid. He had stayed at the Cecil Hotel around the same period as Elisa and had posted videos from inside the building, videos exploring the hotel's dark history, consistent with the aesthetic of the music he made. Internet investigators, working through his publicly available social media presence, identified him as a suspect. The reasoning was superficial. He had been at the hotel. His artistic work dealt with dark themes. Some photographs were interpreted as placing him near Elisa. None of this constituted evidence of anything. He had no connection to her death. He was innocent. But the harassment campaign that followed was severe. Threats, accusations posted across platforms, contact with his family, coordinated efforts to damage his professional reputation. He documented the experience publicly, and it became one of the most clearly illustrated examples in recent memory of what happens when the energy of a true crime investigation is channeled through platforms that have no accountability structures and no requirement for evidence before publication. The Netflix documentary series Crime Scene: The Vanishing at the Cecil Hotel, released in February 2021, brought the case back to wide international attention. The 4-episode series interviewed former guests, hotel employees, LAPD investigators, mental health professionals, and some of the online investigators who had spent years analyzing the footage. It was widely watched and generated significant critical discussion. Much of it focused on the series' decision to devote substantial screen time to the online theorizing, including the harassment of the musician, who appeared in the documentary and described its impact on his life with quiet, measured devastation. Critics argued that the series gave the conspiracy theories more oxygen than they deserved, and that it did not press hard enough on the structural questions about the hotel's safety protocols and the gaps in the official account. Supporters argued that documenting the online investigation was itself a form of accountability, that showing what the internet had done to an innocent person was a necessary part of the story. The series also examined at length the question of Elisa's mental health and its possible role in her death. Several psychiatrists and mental health professionals interviewed for the documentary discussed the ways in which a severe, manic, or mixed state episode associated with bipolar disorder could produce behavior consistent with what the elevator footage showed. The apparent disorientation, the unusual hand movements, the difficulty operating a simple mechanism like an elevator, the apparent shift in affect partway through the footage. They discuss the ways in which travel can disrupt medication schedules and sleep patterns, both of which are significant factors in mood stability for people managing bipolar disorder. The disruption of crossing time zones, sleeping in unfamiliar places, eating at irregular times, these are real stressors for anyone. And for someone managing a mood disorder, they can be destabilizing in ways that are difficult to predict. This is a theory with genuine clinical grounding. It is not a proven account of what happened to Elisa Lam on the night of January 31st, 2013. The coroner's report established cause of death. It did not reconstruct the sequence of events that brought her from the elevator to the roof, to the inside of that tank. That sequence, the specific chain of decisions and movements, the state of mind in which they were made, the question of whether anyone else was present at any point, was never fully established by the investigation. The toxicology findings deserve careful attention because they were frequently mischaracterized in public discussion in ways that distorted the picture. The presence of her prescribed medications in her system was reported by some outlets in language that implied overdose or heavy sedation. The coroner's report did not support either characterization. The detected levels were described as consistent with therapeutic use. The medications themselves, mood stabilizers and antidepressants commonly prescribed for bipolar disorder, can at therapeutic levels affect coordination, reaction time, and judgment, particularly in combination. But the report did not conclude that her medication state alone explained the events of that night or her presence in the water tank. The water tank itself was examined in detail after her body was removed. Investigators documented its dimensions, its construction, the condition of the hatch and its hinges, and the physical accessibility of the tank from the roof platform. A person of average height standing on the platform could reach the rim of the tank. The hatch required lifting and moving a heavy metal lid. The interior offered no ladder, no handholds, no way to climb out unassisted. The platform below the tanks was wet. The tanks had been leaking slightly, which was not unusual for aging infrastructure, and the surface was slick. The hatch, when the maintenance worker arrived, was closed and appeared to be in its normal resting position, not propped or wedged. What is established without dispute is this. Elisa Lam checked into the Cecil Hotel on January 26, 2013. She was last captured on a security camera at approximately 10:47 p.m. on January 31st. Her body was found on February 19th in a rooftop water tank. The official cause of death is accidental drowning. No other individual has been identified as having been involved in her death. The hotel's security and maintenance protocols were found to be inadequate by the family's legal team, a finding the hotel did not contest in the settlement that ended the civil lawsuit. Everything else exists in the space between those facts, and that space is very large, and it has proven to be nearly impossible to close. What makes the Elisa Lam case different from other deaths that are ruled accidental under ambiguous circumstances is the footage. Those 4 minutes and 17 seconds of video released to the world on February 13th, 2013, and watched by tens of millions of people in the weeks that followed, became something more than evidence. They became a kind of collective experience, a shared encounter with something that resisted explanation, something that each viewer processed through their own framework for understanding fear, mental illness, vulnerability, and the limits of what cameras can tell us about what actually happened in a moment. Some people who watched the footage saw a young woman in the grip of a psychiatric crisis, her medication disrupted by travel, her sense of reality fragmenting in the corridor of a hotel that had seen too much suffering already. Some people saw a woman being stalked, her behavior the behavior of prey that knows something is close. Some people saw something they could not name and did not try to. The footage became a Rorschach test for the internet's relationship with mystery, and with the particular kind of mystery that involves a young woman alone in a dangerous place, which is a mystery the culture has never known quite how to hold without either sensationalizing it or reducing it to something manageable. Elisa Lam was 21 years old. She was a sociology student. She kept a blog that was genuinely, quietly beautiful in the way that the writing of a thoughtful young person trying to understand the world can be beautiful. She liked books and music and long walks through neighborhoods that most tourists ignored. She valued independence and acted on that value by traveling alone, which took a particular kind of courage that tends to be under-acknowledged. She had a medical condition that she managed openly, without shame, and with a degree of self-awareness that was remarkable. She called her parents regularly. She was, by every account from people who knew her, a warm and thoughtful person who was genuinely enjoying her life in the days before she disappeared. She deserves to be remembered as that person, not as the subject of a viral video, not as a data point in a theory about the Cecil Hotel's supernatural history, not as a cautionary tale about young women traveling alone, or about mental illness, or about budget hotels in dangerous neighborhoods. She was a person. Her name was Elisa Lam. She was 21 years old, and she was happy, and she called her parents, and she posted photographs of museum exhibits because she found them beautiful, and then something happened that no investigation has been able to fully explain, and she did not come home. Her parents, Yina and David Lam, have given very few public interviews in the years since her death. They attended the proceedings related to the civil lawsuit. They have asked, in the limited statements they have made, for privacy and for accuracy, specifically for people to not reduce their daughter to the elevator footage, to remember that the 4 minutes and 17 seconds of video were not the sum of who she was. That is a reasonable request. It is also, given the scale of the public's engagement with this case over more than a decade, a nearly impossible one to fulfill completely. The footage exists. It will continue to be watched. The questions it raises will continue to be discussed. What can be controlled is whether those discussions begin and end with the footage, or whether they make room for the person who appears in it. The Cecil Hotel itself was purchased by new owners in 2014, shortly after the wrongful death lawsuit was filed. The new ownership undertook extensive renovations over the following years, rebranding the building and converting a significant portion of its rooms to affordable housing units under a city partnership. The building reopened in 2021, the same year the Netflix documentary brought Elisa's case back to international attention. The rooftop water tanks were replaced during the renovation. The lobby's marble floors were restored. The building still stands on Main Street, 14 stories of brick and layered history, in a neighborhood that is still working through its own decades of accumulated difficulty, still trying to find its way to something better than what it has been. The elevator is still there. The LAPD case file on Elisa Lam remains closed, classified as an accidental death. The complete investigative file is not available to the public. Requests submitted under California's Public Records Act have resulted in partial releases, some documents, some photographs, some procedural records. But significant portions of the investigative record, including detailed forensic findings and internal communications, remain sealed. The civil lawsuit, which might have produced substantial discovery of hotel records, maintenance logs, and internal communications about the rooftop alarm and tank access, was settled before any of those documents could become part of the public court record. Whatever those documents contained about the alarm system's operational history on the night of January 31st, 2013, has not been made public. So the questions remain, not because they have been answered and found unsatisfying, but because some of them have genuinely not been answered. The alarm on the rooftop door, was it functioning that night? And if not, why not? And when did it stop functioning, and who knew? The hatch on the water tank, how specifically did it come to be in its closed position? The elevator doors, what caused them to remain open for the full duration of Elisa's time in the car? And what does the LAPD's examination of the elevator's functioning actually show in technical detail? These are mechanical questions. They have mechanical answers. Those answers were not made fully public, and in the absence of public answers, the space they leave behind has been filled with everything else, with theories, with patterns, with projections, with the full weight of the Internet's capacity for both genuine curiosity and genuine harm. What the case leaves behind, beyond the grief of a family and the unresolved questions of an investigation, is something worth sitting with. It is a mirror, not a flattering one. It reflects back the way a large, connected, anonymous public processes tragedy when it is given a piece of footage and no definitive explanation. The harassment of innocent people, the reduction of a complex human life to a viral moment, the manufacture of meaning in coincidences that carry none, the collision between genuine investigative curiosity and the machinery of online spectacle that has no off switch and no accountability. The Elisa Lam case did not create any of these dynamics. They existed before February 2013, but it became one of the clearest and most sustained examples of all of them happening simultaneously, at scale, in real time, over more than a decade. She went into that hotel on a Saturday in January, excited about the next leg of her trip. She had been posting photographs. She had plans. She was happy. Whatever happened in the hours after that elevator footage ends, whatever sequence of events, whatever state of mind, whatever circumstances, known or unknown, she did not come home. Her parents still live in Vancouver. The blog she kept is still accessible online. Its most recent post from January 2013, accumulating comments from strangers who found it through the case and left words there because they did not know where else to put what they felt. The footage is still there, on servers around the world, still being watched, still generating theories, still being analyzed frame by frame by people who are convinced that if they look carefully enough, the image will finally yield its secret. The case officially is closed. If the questions at the center of this story stayed with you, the gaps in the record, the unanswered mechanical details, the weight of what the official account leaves unexplained, There is another case on this channel that carries that same quality. A disappearance where the official conclusion and the physical evidence pointed in two different directions for years, and where the truth, when it finally came, was not what anyone expected. That one is waiting for you next.